Good morning. I'm Patrick Quinn, working with Ben Gazda to interview World War II veteran of the U.S. Army, Kenneth Thayer. Today is November 13th, 2002. Where were you born?
I was born in Floyd, New York, and brought up in Utica. Went to school in Utica.
When was that?
I was born in 1925.
Where were you when you heard about Pearl Harbor?
I was at home. Of course, it was on a Sunday, and one of my uncles lived with us. We were in a family business, and he was laid up. He had wrenched his back, and he was laid up, and had laying in bed with a weight over on his leg to keep tension on his leg, and to keep him going crazy, we were fiddling with a radio, and you've seen them. They're the cathedral-style radio. The dial selector was broken, and we had the radio apart fixing it. And between the two of us, we got the thing fixed and turned it on and hooked it up to an arrowhead outside antenna, big long antenna. We hooked up to an outside antenna, and the first thing we heard was that Pearl Harbor was under attack.
Jeez.
And I ran to the top of the stairs, and I hollered downstairs, and I said to my mother, I says, turn on the big radio. Pearl Harbor is being attacked by the Japanese. That's how it happened.
What branch of the service did you enter?
Army.
And when did you do that?
My first day of active duty was November 18th, 1943.
Why did you choose the Army?
Because I had all the men in my family who had served in World War I were in the Army, and they fought in Europe. The ones who went overseas fought in Europe, and I wanted to do the same.
Where were you trained?
Camp Walters, Texas. That's about, I guess, 20 or 30 miles west of Fort Worth. And it was a camp that had about 70,000 personnel.
What weapons were you trained to use?
I was trained on the 81 millimeter mortar and the 30 caliber water-cooled machine gun. These were called heavy weapons. That was called heavy weapons. And that was a 17-week training program. It had just been reduced from 21 weeks. But this, when we got there, the very first day, morning, they fell us out in front of the barracks. And this brand new second lieutenant, who looked about your age, said, good morning, men. You're here for 17 weeks of training. The cycles before you were 21 weeks, but this has been reduced to 17. But you're going to get 21 weeks of training because we're going to work nights and weekends. And he said, 6 months from now, 2/3 of you will be either dead or wounded. How well you learn your basic training here will help you be among the survivors. So pay attention to what's going on. Learn your training well. He was right. In fact, he was very optimistic. The casualty rate was higher than that. It was more like 7 out of 8.
Wow. Did you have a specialty?
That was my MOS, military occupational specialty. That was it, gunner. And but when I got overseas, I landed on D-Day, and then went back to England, and then came back as a replacement in this outfit here, the 30th Infantry Division, Old Hickory. And I was assigned to a rifle company, and the 4th platoon of a rifle company is what they call a weapons platoon, but they have light guns, 60 millimeter mortars, and air-cooled machine guns, a light machine gun. So I was a mortarman for part of the war and a machine gunner for part of the war.
Were there any memorable events or people while you were in basic training?
No. Nothing special. It was just that it was very tough. Each barracks and the pyramid tents outside, assigned to each platoon, we were over strength, of course. We had more than 80 men, almost 90 men in our platoon. Normally in infantry, there was 41 men. And, but in training, there's a lot more than that. By the time the 17 weeks were up, we were down to about 46, because the men who fell out because they couldn't take the training, and they were assigned to non-combat type jobs. The failure rate was pretty high. And immediately after that, they started sending us overseas. And most of my platoon went to the Pacific and through Fort Ord, California. And I did not want to go to the Pacific. And I kept sweating it out to see if I was going to Europe. And finally, there were just 6 or 7 of us left in the barracks out of the 40 some odd. And somebody came and stuck the notice up on a bulletin board, you know. And I said, the following will report to Fort George G. Meade, Maryland, on such and such a date. And my name was listed there, so that meant you're going to Europe.
What ship brought you to Europe?
Interestingly, it was a troop ship, but it was a captured Italian luxury liner. It was 58,000 tons. It was a big ship. And it was about 800 feet long. And if you read about the Titanic, it was about the same size as the Titanic. And we carried 8,700 troops on board. And it took us 12 days. It had been the Count de Savoia, but it was named the USS Hermitage. Interestingly enough, this insignia is for Old Hickory. It's an O and an H. And that was Andrew Jackson. That was his nickname, Old Hickory. And his home was called the Hermitage. So I went over on a ship named after the home of Andrew Jackson and wound up in a division also named after Andrew Jackson. His picture's on the $20 bill. So it was 12, the Count de Savoia could have made the trip in about 4 days, but we traveled in convoy. And a convoy travels at the rate of the slowest ship, which was 12 knots. So it was a 12-knot convoy. And so all the ships had to travel at 12, even the destroyer escorts and the destroyers who could go, 28 knots. But they had to travel at the same speed as the convoy. There were about 30 or 40 ships in the convoy. We went over in the spring of 1944, April of 1944.
What was it like on the ship?
Crowded. And when we filed down, I said it had been a luxury ship. All the luxuries had been eliminated at the point when we were, because it was only designed to carry about 1,500 passengers, but in luxury, I mean, a real nice ship. We were down below the waterline in what was the gymnasium and swimming pool area and exercise, all this sort of thing. And there were bunks put in. There were 4 high bunks, and they were the fold-down type. They were, pipe and netting, and then a mattress, a very thin mattress on that. And they folded up, you could fold them up during the daytime, and they dropped down at night. And when we got in, you just sorted yourself out. We went in what they call packages of 200. And we went in, and you just go head for a stack of bunks. And one of the fellows says, oh boy, he said, I get seasick in a rowboat. You get the bottom bunk. So, since I went with this guy, I said, I'll take the top bunk. I want to play it safe. And I don't believe in getting seasick. I think that's all mental. And he was seasick all night. and we were still tied up at the pier the next morning. Ship wasn't even moving, and he was sick as crazy. So, but that didn't reform him at all. It was announced that we were going to sail during the night, but we didn't. It was delayed, and because of the timing of the convoy and how long it was going to take us to catch up to the convoy over by Nova Scotia. We didn't have to leave until the next day. But we were escorted by dirigibles way off the coast of Nova Scotia. They went way out to keep submarines away from the convoy. But in the spring of 1943, the submarine U-boat battle had been won, but there were still U-boats in the Atlantic Ocean. But the Allies knew where they all were, and so we were a lot safer than we thought we were. But 12 days on the stormy North Atlantic is an experience. And we could see the ships in the convoy, like the escorts, the destroyers, which the Navy called tin cans. The destroyer, which is a good sight. When you walk down to a pier and look at a destroyer, it looks like it looks like the school. You know, it looks big, but in comparison to other warships, they're small. And we would see the destroyers around the convoy and the big ocean rollers. You would see them go down behind those and completely disappear. They would completely disappear. You say, well, when is he coming up? You know, and pretty soon you'd see the bow of the ship come up, and all the water be pouring off the bow of the ship, and they just bury the bow of the ship in a big roller coming over. And there wasn't a dry piece of clothing or a bunk on that ship, I'm sure. But then it would come up, and then when it would come down the other side, the screws, the twin screws, would come up out of the water, and you could see them. And at first they'd start to race, and then they'd stop, because they had an automatic braking system. That when the water resistance suddenly ceased, the brakes grabbed the shaft so that it wouldn't tear itself apart. But what a life that was. And the destroyer wasn't the smallest escort. The destroyer escort was even smaller than that, and that was an even rougher ride. But the County Savoia was the first transatlantic ocean ship that had gyroscopic controls. It had a giant gyroscope built into the hull of the ship, which controlled its pitch and roll. So it was a lot steadier than any other ship of its comparable size, even in a storm. And it was storm for the whole 12 days. And it was gray and really miserable. And I spent the entire 12 days on deck. God, I liked it up there. And I would say of the 8,700 troops on board, all but about 700 were seasick. These guys were just seasick all the time. And I couldn't understand why. But the nice thing of that was that you only got fed twice a day at sea. And the nice thing was there was a lot of extra food for those of us who were not seasick. So we had all the apples and oranges and fruit and all that stuff. We had all the food we could eat. And then there was a PX on board, at least one I found. And there were probably others. And I bought a box of Hershey bars almost every day. 12 Hershey bars of a box. And I ate almost a whole box of Hershey bars every day. And by eating a lot of food and sweets, you don't get sick. You don't get motion sick. I was just playing it safe. And then when we went across the English Channel, that was the worst weather in the English Channel in 25 or 30 years. And we crossed in a flat bottom landing craft infantry, LCI. And then for the actual invasion, we went in invasion barges from 11.5 miles out. And every single person in that invasion barge was sick, except the Coast Guard coxswain who was operating the invasion barge and me. We were the only two people who weren't seasick. But that thing was just, that was just murder. It was just terrible. And they were right, it was just terrible. And slow. And that's like going from here, where we're sitting, to Utica, to North Utica. And a flat bottom invasion barge at about 6 or 7 miles an hour. That was a rough ride. So that was my ocean experience.
What did you do before June 6th?
A training. When we arrived in Liverpool, England, and we were split up then. I mean, there were 8,700 people put on trains and split up and going in all directions. And I was put on a train with a group of men to go to Scotland. We went to Scotland and took specialized training under the Black Watch. They were a Highlander Scottish outfit. Even our officers were under their non-commissioned officers. And they put us through some very tough, it was very similar to commando type training. And it kept us busy. I think most of it was just to keep us busy. And then when we finished that, we went down to near Southampton and into a holding area, well, Salisbury actually, Salisbury, England, to a camp waiting for the invasion. And I went in with 2 elements, 2 invasion barge elements. And there, we were just enlisted men whose job it was to protect them. They were forward observers to coordinate the naval gunfire and artillery fire when it got ashore. And our job was to protect them because they didn't know if the invasion was going to be a success or not. And somebody had to defend these people. One of them was a naval officer, although he was wearing an Army uniform. And his job was a liaison to the naval ships. We had, sitting offshore Omaha Beach, were more than 4,000 ships. More than 4,000. And I mean, you would think that you could walk all the way back to England just by ships. But ships are very small in the middle of the ocean. And were all sizes. There were 2 battleships out there supporting us. Among destroyers and battleships and cruisers, all kinds, and rocket launching ships and all kinds of ships out there. And one of the battle wagons was the California, which had been sunk at Pearl Harbor and refloated and refitted and modernized and sent to the Atlantic. And it was what it supported. They had 15-inch guns. And when they fired over our heads, we were in close, they were out behind us, they were firing over our heads. And you could see the shells when they fire a broadside. You could see the shells going through the air from behind them. You could see them, they were like ducks flying. And each shell, I think, in a 15-inch gun, the shells were about 1,800 pounds. It was like firing a Volkswagen over your head. And of course, they could fire 20 miles. So they were firing at strategic targets, inland. And they were firing at crossroads, railroad stations, that sort of thing, to break up, to break up the people who were defending, who were coming forward to defend the coast.
When did you know you were going to Normandy?
We were never told that it was Normandy. And I didn't even know it was Omaha Beach until that night. And I said, where are we? And we knew we were in France. I said, where are we? Well, the code name for this location is Omaha, Omaha Beach. And I said, Omaha? There isn't even any water in Nebraska. Where did they get that name, But that was just a code name. And we were told that we knew when we were training to protect these observers, these artillery observers, that we were going to be a part of the invasion. We knew that. Nobody told us, though. And when you see in the movies getting you've seen the troops getting all of this detailed information. That's not the way it was. We were supposed to get briefed on the specifics of our mission on the way into the beach. And of course, the lieutenant, who was our commander, who was in charge of this detail that I was in, he was so sick he couldn't even speak. And the water was so rough that we were taking water over the sides and it was splashing in, and we were trying to bail out with our helmets and all this stuff. And the guys were sick and throwing up. We were soaking wet and salt in our eyes because it's salt water and you're covered with salt. It was just terrible. And we went in after, our job wasn't to take the beach, it was after they took the beach. We went in, thank God. And when the young coxswain who took us in, that's what they call a guy who operates small boats in the Navy or the Coast Guard. He was about 19 or 20 years old, and he backed and went forward and backed and monkeyed around, and he put us right on the beach. I didn't even get my feet wet. When he dropped that ramp down, I just walked off on sand, where other fellas were dumped off farther out. And so this was at night. But in France during World War II, we learned that it didn't get dark till almost 11 o'clock at night. This is summer now. But there's something different about that place. And of course we were on double daylight saving time. And so it was still daylight when we landed, and we went up and we walked up off the beach up to the bluff and back inland a ways, maybe a mile or two. And we thought we were going to pitch our tents, our pup tents. No, we don't pitch any pup, you dig a foxhole. So I dug my first foxhole of one every day. Dug a foxhole every day. And that was the first one. And we had been told, Eisenhower had announced, General Eisenhower had announced that if you see any airplanes over the beach, they will be American, because there will be no Luftwaffe, no German Air Force. And he was right, except at night. Our airplanes went back to England at dark. They didn't fly at night. But the German Air Force did. And they had they had airplanes, they were called the Ju-80, a twin-engine fighter bomber. And they patrolled up and down the beach looking for targets. And we called him Bed Check Charlie, because in basic training, the charge of quarters comes through every night and checks the barracks to make sure everybody's in bed where they belong. And he's called Bed Check. You had Bed Check every night. Whether you were in basic training or any other place of the Army or Navy, you had a Bed Check. And so this guy was it was a unanimous choice of everybody individually that he would be called Bed Check Charlie, because just as soon as our Air Force left, he came out. And of course there were several of these Bed Check Charlies. We were only interested in the one who was flying over us. And he was looking for targets of opportunity. And the whole anti-aircraft mission would fire at this guy. And it would be just like the 4th of July or the end of the Olympics when you see all this fireworks going up. Well, that's the way it was. I mean, every machine gun, every anti-aircraft gun, every 40mm anti-aircraft gun, 50 caliber machine gun, all were firing at this guy. And I mean, they were firing, a ton of ammunition a minute. Nobody ever scratched this guy. They never scratched him. He just, boom, 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 boom. He just keep right going. And the engines were not synchronized. The propellers weren't synchronized like ours. It was a steady drone, but they could never get on the Ju-80. They could never get the engines synchronized. So you had to sound about boom, 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 a noise like that. And you could hear Bed Check Charlie coming for miles. And you made sure that there was never a light of any kind. Never a light of any kind. Once it got dark, You never lit a match, you never lit a flashlight. No, you never smoked a cigarette. I didn't smoke anyway, but you never smoked a cigarette. Because if you lit a match, you could see that for 2 miles from the air. And he would drop flares. He would come out and drop flares, which we call chandeliers. Ben check Charlie, chandeliers. He would drop these parachute flares. And if he was only a couple thousand feet, you understand? He was low and slow. And he would drop these flares. And if you looked up, it was just like a shiny nickel on the ground to him. I mean, it would reflect off your face. So when he dropped a flare, you kept your head down and you stopped. No matter what you were doing or where you were going, you stopped. You just froze in place. No motion, because they could detect motion. And so you learned to do that to survive. I was lucky when I was sent back to England, because we weren't attached to anybody for rations, so when our food ran out, the forward observers were, but the protected team wasn't, and they didn't need us anymore anyway. So we were put on another invasion barge, back out to a ship, back to England, in a replacement training, in a replacement center, then back across the channel and assigned to a regular outfit, this one. And I joined it in hedgerow country, and I don't know if you've ever noticed this or know about it, but when I was a kid, people in Holland were pictured as wearing wooden shoes. These little boat-like things, wooden shoes. Nobody in Holland wore wooden shoes, but in France they wore wooden shoes. All through Normandy, everybody wore wooden shoes, just like those Dutch wooden shoes. And the reason was it was so damp. Normandy is very damp and very green, like Ireland, but it's very damp. And so they wore the wooden shoes, not only for economical reasons, but to protect their feet from the dampness. To give you an idea of what we wore during the invasion, well, I'll start with, first of all, this is in June. We wore 2-piece long cotton underwear. We wore wool olive drab uniform, pants and shirt. Over that we wore fatigues, 2-piece fatigues. What you see these people walking around in camouflage. No, it was like that, only with just one. It was this color. For the invasion, and for a few weeks after the invasion, our fatigues had, before we put them on, the fibers had been impregnated with a waxy substance, to seal out any gas that the Germans might use. We didn't know whether everybody used gas warfare. And so we had a gas mask. But because this cloth was impregnated and sealed, it was like an oven inside of this thing. And why would we wear all these clothes? Because at night, that was your bed. You slept. You didn't have any bedding. You had a raincoat or a poncho, depending on where it was issued. And if your 2 men slept in a foxhole, you put one raincoat on the ground and slept on it, and the other raincoat you put over you. That was the only shelter you had. And also, you were running and stopping, and I was carrying a 60-millimeter mortar fully assembled, and that was about 36 pounds, in addition to all my gear, all my regular gear that everybody carried, 4 hand grenades, a quart of water, a light pack. So, without the mortar, my equipment probably weighed 35 pounds, and the mortar was another 35 or 40 pounds, carrying a lot of weight. And you're running with this. You don't walk anyplace. When you go from one point to another, you go as fast as you can go. So you really get heated up, and then you might lay in this wet grass for 2 hours, and then get up and go again. Well, while you were laying in this wet grass, everybody would have pneumonia if you didn't have this, if you didn't have this protective layer of clothing, several layers of clothing. So it sounds crazy, but it worked. After we'd been on the ground in Normandy for about, I guess maybe 4 weeks, it was determined that the Germans were not going to use gas. So we took these, we divested ourselves of these. The supply sergeant came up, gave us new fatigues, regular fatigues, and we turned these in and they were washed and laundered and recycled back to other troops. That was taken out. I learned years later from listening to old-time radio at night on 91.9 that there was a program back during that time called Fibber, McGee and Molly, and they were sponsored by the Johnson's Wax Company. And in one of these, that was played just a few months ago, an old-time radio, World War II era program, they announced that Johnson's Wax made this material that sealed our fatigues against gas. So how did we protect ourselves against gas? We had leggings, and our trousers were stuffed in the leggings. So that was gas-proof. Our body was gas-proof. We had a gas mask. We had gloves. These were wool gloves with leather facing, and everybody was issued these. And you wore these. I mean, you didn't wear them during the day, you didn't have to, but I mean, you had them. And so if there was a gas attack, you had gloves so you were protected, and you had a gas mask on, and you put the collar of your field jacket. You had a special collar on your field jacket, so the field jacket collar could button up high around here so it overlapped. So you were pretty well covered. You were pretty well covered. Fortunately, we didn't have to. It was determined that the Germans were never going to use gas because their spies had learned that we had more of it than they had, and it was a violation of the Geneva Convention, which they had signed after World War I. And so we still carried our gas mask in case, but the pressure was off from about 3 or 4 weeks after the invasion until the end of the war.
Did you encounter any other sorts of resistance besides the Ju-88 or the fear of gas attack?
Well, we were being shot at all the time, naturally. German artillery and German mortars, German artillery. Just to give you some idea, in an infantry division there were 3 regiments. The total strength of a regular infantry division in World War II was about 15,000 men. Of those 15,000, there are only about 3,600 who were actual combat troops. The other people were administrative, logistics. They were the people who brought the supplies up, brought your rations up, and they were the cooks and all kinds of things. So the cutting edge of an infantry, the cutting edge of the Army was the infantry on the ground, and this was about 3% of the total U.S. Army were this type of person, like I was. But we suffered 70% of all the casualties in World War II. My division took in excess of 16,000 casualties. Now that counted me 3 times, because I was wounded 3 times. So if you're wounded, you're a casualty. It doesn't mean you're dead. But the turnover rate was high. When I joined my division in July, they'd already gone through a couple of replacement cycles. Some of the original men had already gone back to the hospital to England or were killed. And when I came on board, there were supposed to be 5 or 6 men in my squad, in a mortar squad, and there was only 1. And my company had the company strength was about 185 men. There were about 60 when I got there. The rest were all dead or wounded. So every so often, the unit would be put in reserve for a few days while replacements would come in and fill it back up again. Um, if you were to look at I wrote a book. If you were to look at my book, in the front of it, you'll see a picture of a grave site in Holland, in a U.S. military cemetery called Margraten near Maastricht, Holland. And there are 8,700, same number that was on the ship. There are 8,700 GIs buried there, and the average age is 19 and a half years. Pretty young. Pretty young. Not much older than you fellas are. And this means these fellas never had a new car. They never had their first new car. They didn't have a chance to go to college. They didn't have a chance to get a college education. They didn't buy a house. They had no family, no wife or family. Their life ended at that age. And the typical infantryman was about 18 to 20. That was the age of a typical infantryman. We had one fellow in our outfit who was 26. We called him Pop. He was an old man to us, 26 years old. So our company commander was 30, but he was a reserve officer, and he'd been in the service in reserves a long time. Okay.
All right. What was your reaction to being transferred to the 30th Infantry Division?
I had never heard of it until I got there. And we got a little orientation about what the division was about and a little bit of the history. You know, somebody gave you a little history, a little quickie orientation. Then we were sent to the front. And that's what I was there for. That's what I expected. There was one thing I did not expect, however. I thought that the way the war was going to be fought was kind of like it was in the movies. That we would attack some town or some objective, and the Germans would fire off a few shells and give up. Or they'd shoot at us for a while and then all surrender and we'd take the next town. And that wasn't the way it was at all. They fought to the last man. They were outstanding soldiers. And if you took an objective, like you took a village, you consolidated your position immediately and put out a perimeter of defense, usually with tank destroyers and anti-tank guns or tanks or whatever you had, plus infantry. Because once you threw them off their objective, they would counterattack. And if you defeated them in the afternoon, sometime during that night, they're going to hit you again and try to take it back. Always counterattack. Always counterattack. And it was sometimes they'd let you take an objective so that they could counterattack from your flanks. So you had to be very, very careful. And you could not be careless. You couldn't be careless at all. You had to be very, very careful. When I arrived, a sergeant, he was a tech sergeant, he was the platoon sergeant of this platoon that I was assigned to. His name was Proby, and it's his grave site that's in my book, in the front of my book, in Margraten. He looked at me and he called me Pee-wee. And he says, Pee-wee, I'm going to keep you alive. I can keep you alive for 2 days. You do everything I tell you to do when I tell you to do it. Don't ask anybody. If I tell you to do it. And he said, if I tell you not to do something, don't do it. And if you see me do something, do what I do. If you see me hit the ground, you hit the ground. And he says, that will keep you alive for 2 days. If you make it for the first 2 days, your chances of making it for an extended period or even surviving are very good. Because the typical replacement was killed within 2 days or wounded within 2 days. That was your life expectancy. So it was kind of a rough life.
in northern France, was the fighting very fierce, or was it like calm then fierce? Or
Every day was a day of combat. We were never off the line. My division was never off the line until we got to the German border. And we fought continuously every day. Well, except once in a while, the company would be in reserve, in the regimental reserve or battalion reserve. And then you could go down to a creek or something and wash up and shave and do your laundry and stuff like that. And then the next day you'd be back on the line again. And this was considered a big break to have a day off. But normally you're on the front line every day. And I don't know if you've had an experience like this, most drivers have, where you have come along and suddenly there's somebody in front of you, right in front of your car on a bicycle, or some kid who has run out in the middle of the road, and you, or a dog or a deer or something, and you jam on the brakes for all you're worth, and your seatbelt locks and the whole thing, and you don't hit whatever it is you're trying not to hit, and the kid with the ball leaves, or the guy on a bicycle gets out of the way, or whatever, and your heart is up in your throat, and I mean your heart is pounding and you're shaking because you've had this close call. Well, when you're in combat, that happens about once an hour. You have a close call like that about once an hour, and you're under constant artillery. I mean, they don't fire shells 24 hours a day, but I mean, you're under observation. And every so often they fire a barrage of shells in, and you have to hit the ground and hope for the best. And you're always subjected to machine gun fire, sniper fire, rifle fire, tank fire. So you have to learn to be a survivor. You have to learn your job. You have to learn how to protect yourself. And the problem is that after you've done this for several months, you begin to wonder if you're a fugitive from the law of averages, because you see all these other fellows come into your outfit and go, and come into your outfit and go, and you're still there. And you're wondering, you know, after a while you can't help but wonder, you know, when is it going to be my turn? So this is always on your mind. Is it your turn? The other side of that was everybody that I knew in my outfit had a tremendous sense of humor. There was jokes and kidding around all the time. And this was a means of survival. People did crazy things. And we had, of course, this was a Southern outfit, and we had a lot of Southern Baptists in our outfit. And we captured a German in Normandy, or several Germans in Normandy, and one of them, they wore very fancy uniforms, much fancier than ours. And they wore these very dress leather belts and belt buckles, fancy brass belt buckles. And this one fellow, they weren't allowed to keep any of that stuff, and because they could all be used as weapons. And so they had to divest themselves. It was a dress belt. It just wasn't the one to hold up their pants. They had suspenders to hold up their pants. And they usually had a unit slogan of some kind that was inscribed on their belt buckle, a part of the belt buckle. And this one said, Gott mit uns. And this one fellow from this deep south, he said, what does that mean? And I knew a little German, and I said, it means God is with us. And he says, it can't mean that. I said, well, it's practically in English. And this particular German could speak a little English, and he says, your friend is right, it says God is with us. And this fellow was absolutely incensed. He says, that's a damn lie. God is with us. It never occurred to him that we were fighting deeply religious people. And they were very religious people. The common ordinary soldier was deeply religious. But I mean, we thought that I couldn't get over that this guy couldn't believe that they believed in God the same as we did. Another thing, because this was a rebel outfit from the South, from the Deep South, not Deep South, but from the South, when we were taking farms and liberating farms and so on, the farmers would come out to the lane where we were advancing up. If we were, hiking up a lane someplace, and they would say, "Are you Yankees? Are you Yankees?" And these fellows from the South would say, "Hell no, we're not Yankees." And because they weren't. And they would say, "Are you English? Are you English?" Say, "No, we're not English." And they would look at us, they would wonder, who the heck are these soldiers? They're speaking in English, but they're not Americans and they're not English. I wonder who they are. They were perplexed at this. So we told these fellows, for the duration, you're probably going to have to be Yankees. After the war, you can go back to being rebels, but for now, you're going to have to be Yankees. And this was a big joke to us, because we couldn't imagine why they would object to being called, because that's what they were called in World War I, the Yanks. And the British called us Yanks. And we didn't. We'd call each other GIs, which stands for government issue. And I might mention that I never heard one patriotic word spoken by any GI in a year and 11 months that I was in the service. Nobody ever said, "We're fighting for freedom, we're fighting for this, we're fighting because our country needed us." And it was left unsaid. We knew why we were there. And after the war, when I became enamored with the subject of history, it occurred to me that we were fighting to liberate Europe and to prevent England, the Great Britain, from being overrun, and also to liberate the Germans as well from their dictatorship. But some of the countries over there were fighting to preserve their empire. Britain was fighting to preserve its empire. They weren't all that interested in liberating the French and the Dutch and so on. As from a government position, I'm sure the King of England wasn't all that concerned about whether France had been the British enemy for centuries. But they were interested in keeping India and Australia and Canada. England, that little tiny country and that little island over there, owned a big chunk of the world. And they were very much interested in preserving that. And of course they didn't. Because of a great deal of pressure put on by the United States, England was forced to dismantle its empire and to grant much more independence to Australia and Canada. Canada has its own constitution. It didn't have its own constitution then. So the world changed forever. My world changed forever, I know that.
What was the most terrifying moment during your campaign in northern France?
There were too numerous to mention. But I could name one of them was when we were bombed by our own Air Force. In Normandy, we're trying to break out of this hedgerow country, and the commanding general of the 12th Army Group, General Omar N. Bradley, decided that we were going to have a carpet bombing of a very small area, 2 miles by 1 mile, a little square area. And then this carpet bomb would be done by heavy bombers, 4-engine bombers. And then, just as soon as that bombing ended, he would pour 2 infantry divisions through there. My division and the 9th Division would pour through there. And it was his request that there was a little straight road for about 4 or 5 miles there, called the St. Perrier Road, and it was very visible from the air. And he asked the Air Force to come in and bomb on the German side parallel to that road. And the Air Force never agreed to that, but he thought they had agreed to it. But what they did was they bombed from behind us, from back to front. And they came over like a conveyor belt. And there were 1,800 heavy and medium bombers. 1,800. All in the air at the same time, coming across the channel, just like a conveyor belt. And they started bombing in this square, in this rectangle. As briefed, they bombed as briefed. But as the smoke and whatnot worked its way backward, and as the bomb began to creep backwards, like this, so they weren't all going on the other side of that road, they began to come on our side of the road. And so my division, took a lot of casualties because we were bombed by the 8th Air Force. Some of their bombs fell 1,600 yards short, a long ways short. And one of them, boy, just missed me, I'll tell you. And we could see them walking. It was like they were walking right down the road, you know, one bomb, bomb, bomb. But they were going like this, one on this side, one on this side, one on, just the way the pattern was. And when I got to where I was, the bomb was on the other side of this little dirt road. And so it missed me. But we lost 640, I think it was 641 men, something like that. And a 3-star general was killed who was visiting the front, inspecting. He was on an inspection tour of the front. Lieutenant General Leslie J. McNair, for whom Fort McNair in the Washington area is named. And he was killed that day. And he was the highest ranking United States officer killed in World War II. But he was killed by our own. He was killed by our own bombs. Every once in a while we'd be attacked by our own Air Force by mistake. Fighter bombers would come down and strafe the wrong target. They'd strafe us instead of somebody else. And this was a frightening experience. And so that was a very bad thing. During the Battle of Bulge, we were attacked by the German SS. And the Battle of Bulge occurred in the wintertime of 44, 45. And this was a tremendous counteroffensive by the Germans in the winter. And they came down to the Ardennes Mountains in Belgium. And we weren't there. We were up in Germany. But we were transferred down there the next day after the attack started. And they attacked with 600,000 troops along a long front in the Ardennes Mountains, much like the Adirondacks, very similar to the Adirondacks. It was a resort area. And they penetrated about 50 miles. They really came at us. And my division was sent down on the northern shoulder of this to keep them from, they came through in a point, essentially like an arrow. And the way tactics are is when you penetrate, then you broaden it out so that you have room to maneuver. Well, the guys you are attacking try to keep that arrow as narrow as possible so you have no room to maneuver. And so we were put on the northern shoulder of this to push in on the northern shoulder. And it so happened that there was the 6th SS Panzer Army, and they had all the heavy tanks, the Tiger tanks, and the SS troops. And the SS troops did not comply with the Geneva Convention. They shot prisoners, they shot civilians, children, and they massacred in Malmedy, they massacred a couple hundred GIs who were prisoners of war. They just took them on the field and shot them. So this was a massacre. And the commander of it was Lieutenant Colonel Joachim Piper. He was a regimental commander. And they hit us on the 19th of December. And everybody in my company of 185 men who were not killed or wounded were taken prisoner. We were surrounded. I was wounded and evacuated to the hospital in Paris. But about 40 of our men were taken prisoner. I didn't know that, but that night on the Armed Forces radio, they said that Company K, 119th Infantry Regiment of the 30th Division had had 100% casualties. And that was devastating to me. And of course I was one of them because I was wounded. And my whole right side was paralyzed. And it turned out that about 35 or 40 of these guys were prisoners. And they were held for several days, and there were 2 SS soldiers who were guarding them in a sanitarium in this place in Belgium. And one afternoon, late afternoon, one of these SS soldiers came to one of the non-commissioned officers who was a prisoner there, that they had a prisoner in his cellar. And he said, we have been told that we are going to, because they were losing. They were out of gas, they were losing the war. They were losing that battle, and he said, we are going to be pulling out tomorrow. And before we pull out, you're all going to be shot. The commander has said, you're all going to be shot. And he said, I'm a soldier, I'm not a war criminal. He said, I'm not a murderer. Now this is an SS soldier. He says, I'm not a murderer, I'm a soldier. And he said, I don't want to be a part of that. So he said, I know where your lines are. And he pointed to the direction where our lines were. And he says, it's not very far. And he said, my partner and I, this other SS soldier, he said, at such and such a time we're going out and take a break. Don't be here when we come back. But he said, before I go, I want you to write a note that I can have and that my partner can have that says we released you, so that after the war, if anybody's brought up on war crimes charges, this fellow spoke English, he said, if anybody's brought up on war crime charges, we will have a note from you that we freed you so that you would not be shot. And this sergeant said, do you realize that if your superiors catch you with that note, what's going to happen to you? If they find that note on you, what's going to happen to you? What will happen to your families? Why don't you surrender to us and go with us? So here this sergeant who was a prisoner of war talking to this SS soldier. And he says, why don't you go with us? And he said, I'll talk to my partner. They talked to my partner, and they came back, and he said, when you go, we'll go with you. We'll go as your prisoners. Now, they were SS soldiers, and they were the meanest, most miserable, violent people in the German army. But there were also there were some who were very humanitarian. So, there's 2 sides to it. What else?
What type of effect did the weather have on your weapons during the Battle of the Bulge?
None. Because I was only in the Battle of the Bulge 3 days. And I had a light machine gun, and it didn't take long to heat that thing up. You fired 6 rounds out of it, and the barrel was hot.
Do you know of anyone who had problems with like their M1s?
No. You were taught how to keep. You slept if you slept at night. You slept with it right next to your body. If you were wearing an overcoat, you put it inside your overcoat and kept it warm, because that thing had to work no matter what. And the Garand M1 rifle, many people believe today was the best assault weapon ever built, including the ones we have today, because it was 30 caliber, had a 2,900 feet per second muzzle velocity, and you could pick off a man at 500 yards. I could. You could pick off a man if it wasn't a windy day and you had your windage set right and you had your elevation set right, you could pick off a person if he was standing still. You could pick off a soldier, an enemy soldier, at 500 yards. That's pretty good shooting. You can't do that with an M16 or any of these pop guns that we have today. And you get hit with a 30 caliber. You get hit with a 30 caliber bullet that's traveling 2,900 feet a second. You're going down, pal, and you're going to stay down. I was also, but my primary weapon, since I was carrying either a mortar or a machine gun, was the GI-45. That was the only weapon I was ever issued, was a GI-45. Because my weapon was this other thing, this gun. And the gunner and assistant gunner only were issued a GI-45. Now, standing in this room on a good day, I could probably hit one of the walls with that 45. Because I was a lousy shot with a 45, with a good shot with a rifle, but a lousy shot with that 45. So it was a personal defense weapon, that's all. It was just personal, for personal defense. But for it to be any good, they'd have to be as close as you two fellas are. And I don't want any enemy soldiers to get that close to me. So I carried a M1 carbine besides that. You could have any weapon you wanted. You could carry a submachine gun, you could carry an M1 rifle, you could carry 2 M1 rifles, you could do anything you want because there was so much surplus stuff laying around the battlefield. If you needed an M1 rifle, you just wouldn't pick one up someplace because there was always some dead GI laying around. So I found a carbine, and but they would ask you, do you want something else besides the pistol? Yeah, I want a carbine. So, but because you carried the machine gun on your shoulder, you couldn't carry a rifle in the ordinary position because it would stick up and get in your way. So the carbine you could carry muzzle down because it was small, almost like a 22. You carried it muzzle down and with the strap forward, the sling forward. So that if you had to use it, you would just grab it like this and swing it up and you could shoot, all in one motion. So you always had a round in the chamber, always had a round in the chamber with a safe on. And all you had to do was just push the safe off and fire. So I always carried a carbine besides my 45. And whether I was carrying a machine gun or whether I was carrying a mortar. So, but I know fellows who carried a carbine and a Thompson submachine gun also. You never had too much, and I always carried at least 4 hand grenades. And I carried, as I say, my 45, a carbine, 4 hand grenades, and you could carry anything you wanted, carry all the ammunition you wanted. So there was no shortage of anything like that. And if you hit the ground too hard and broke the stock on your rifle or broke the stock on your carbine or anything like that, you just pass the word back and somebody would send another one up and you'd have another one 10 minutes, you know. It was no big deal. And one of the funny things that happened in Normandy, and it's in my first book, we were being assisted by P-47 fighter bombers. This was a big 14,000-pound fighter plane with a big radial engine. And it had 8 machine guns, 4 in each wing. And they would come down over your head and strafe in front of you. And they would knock out enemy positions or tanks. They'd drop bombs on the tanks. And this one fighter, there were elements of 4, they would come over and strafe and bomb. And this one guy got shot down. His plane got hit. And he was real close to the ground, but he had enough momentum because it was such a heavy airplane. He pulled up like this and turned over and fell out of it and dropped out of the cockpit. I mean, that's the idea, he'd drop out of it. And the airplane went down and went straight down and hit the ground. And when he floated to the ground, nobody shot, the Germans didn't shoot at him. And we guessed that the reason was they didn't want to ruin his parachute because that was pure silk. And this was worth its weight in gold, so they didn't want to shoot up this trophy. And so he landed and he came running over to where our hedgerow was, but he didn't know which direction he was running, so he had his hands behind his head like this to show that he was surrendering. We told him to move it and get over here, and he came over and he said, "Oh, but you're okay. You're on friendly lines." And he said, "Where in my airplane though?" His airplane had gone right into the ground, and of course there was nothing left of it. And he says, "This is my first mission." It was a brand new second lieutenant right over from the States. And he says, that's a brand new P-47 I was flying. He says, this is the first mission for me and a first combat mission for that airplane, and I lost it. He said, I'm gonna go to Leavenworth for 40 years. I think he thought they were gonna make him pay for it, you know. But he was so upset because he'd been shot down on his first mission. Well, nobody was gonna do anything. They were just gonna mail him back to England, put him in another new airplane, and he's gonna fly a mission the next day. You know, nobody cared if he lost an airplane. Who cares? You know, they're coming across off the assembly line like cookies out of a cookie machine. So there was no big deal. We were building 50,000 airplanes a year in this country. It's bombers, fighters, and cargo airplanes. That's a lot of airplanes.
Oh. Did the weapons perform better in the cold weather?
No. They were adequate. They served their purpose.
How were you treated by the local population during the Bulge?
A woman about 30 years old and her little daughter, who was 9 or 10 years old, saved my life. Because we were defending a strong point. I was the only surviving person in that strong point, and I was badly wounded, and I couldn't save myself. And the German SS, these people I'm telling you about, were going through this little village, about like Placid. They were going through this village shooting all the wounded men, all the wounded Americans with pistols. I could hear the pistol shots, and I knew what that meant. And I couldn't, my right side was paralyzed, and I'm right-handed, and my pistol was over here, and I was badly wounded and bleeding like crazy, and I was trying to get my pistol out so that if they come through to shoot me, I'm going to take somebody with me, that's for sure. And with that, this lady came in, this Belgian lady came in with her little girl, and they were looking to see if anybody, because they heard these shots too, and they were looking, and they were laying their lives on the line, and they were looking to see if there were any survivors. They found me, and they tied me up using the sleeves and the belt of my raincoat, or a belt, and they tied me up, and they dragged me across the frozen, it was just a very light snow, very thin, and almost heavy frost. They dragged me out of this building and around back of a farmhouse, and where I could get first aid. And if they hadn't done that, I wouldn't be here. I'd be one of those 19-year-olds in the Margaret. So they saved my life. But we found that the people, the French, some of the French treated us very good, but some of the French couldn't care less about us. The Belgians were very good to us, and the Dutch were the best of all. The Dutch people were absolutely the best people of all, as far as Americans were concerned. And the Germans were next in their treatment of us. The Germans were very good. They were scared to death of us at first, but when they learned that they had nothing to fear from us, the Germans were very good to us. And on occasions when I went back to Germany, the first time I went back to Germany, my wife and I went back, and my wife said, we're not going to go into, we were in Holland, she's visiting our friends in Holland, and she said, we're not going to Germany. And I said, why not? I want to go back up to this place where these events took place near Aachen. And she said, well, you don't want to go up there. They were your enemy. I said, no, they weren't. The German army was our enemy. These people were civilians. They were in just as much danger as we were. And they had to live in their cellars. Their husbands and sons were all gone off to the war on a Russian front. And the women were running the streetcars and the fire department and everything else. And they had little kids to worry about. And there were minefields all over the place. They didn't want the kids running out and blowing up in the minefields, you know, out in the rural areas. And so I took her to this one little town, North Würselen, in Germany, which was just over the Dutch border, and from Holland. And And my wife wouldn't get out of the car. I had rented a VW Bug, of all things, and a little red one, and my wife wouldn't get out. She says, I'm not getting out. I'm not getting out here. These are all Germans here. And I went over, and I went up to this particular house where we had a command post there. Our platoon had a command post set up there. And these two ladies were now widows, because they never told us if their husbands were in the service or not. I don't think they were. But they were widows, they were sisters. And I went up to the kitchen door where we had slept on her kitchen floor for several days. And we had given her rations, part of the rations and stuff. And we were very nice to her, and she was there. They were very nice to us. And I knocked on the door, and she came to the door. Now it's 30 years later, almost to the day. And she comes to the door, and she looks at me, and she throws her arms around me and hugs me. And her nickname was Kleiner Soldat, the little soldier. And she says, Kleiner Soldat, and Coke, and she called me Cupcake. So she throws her arms around me, and she's crying and carrying on. My wife couldn't believe it. So her sister's taking off her apron and fluffing up her hair, and she goes in the house and she starts calling neighbors on the telephone. And pretty soon there's 20 people around this little courtyard, and they're all talking in German. And one is a school teacher, a man is a school teacher, and he spoke excellent English. These ladies didn't speak English. And so I kept motioning for my wife to get out of the car. Finally, very hesitatingly, my wife got out of the car, came across the street, and she came over and she stood in back of me, and she says, I don't understand this at all. She says, you guys shot up this town? You killed their husbands and brothers? She said, my God, I can't understand why they're so happy to see you. And the school teacher translated that into German for these two ladies. And when he did that, of course, everybody understood what my wife had been saying, and all these people that were gathered on it understood what she had said. And the minute he translated that into German, you could hear a pin drop. Everybody stopped talking. And they looked at my wife. And the lady who had hugged me, she spoke to him in German, a very short sentence in German. And he turned to my wife and he said, Frau so-and-so says, your husband liberated us too.
Back to the Battle of the Bulge. Did you ever think the Germans would break through?
We didn't know anything about that front down there. We were up in Germany. We knew nothing about the Ardennes. There are two schools of thought on that. It was thinly manned, very thinly manned, with troops that were either green, as in the case of the 106th Division, or troops that were recuperating from vicious fighting like the 28th Division. But it was very thinly manned. There were only 4 divisions there in this great big long 80-mile front. And there was nowhere, a normal division front would be 5 miles. So these people they had foxholes with 2 men, and they were just within shouting distance of another foxhole, And the two schools of thought are that Eisenhower and Bradley believed that the Germans would never come through there in the winter, and therefore it was a nice safe place to have new troops or recuperating divisions that were being filled up with replacements and retrained and so on. The other school of thought is that they knew damn well that was a place where the Germans would very likely come through, and they wanted them to come through there so that they could eliminate a big chunk of the German army, and that's what happened. I don't know which one is true, but that was their last offensive. they came through, there were 600,000 men, and we had 83,000 casualties in the Battle of Bulge. Well, we had 83,000 in about 3 weeks, in the first 3 weeks, because they really come charging through there. And the Germans probably had 3 times that in casualties. They lost all their tanks. They lost all their tanks, half-tanks, artillery. They couldn't get them back across the Rhine River, which was in back of them now. And so instead of having those troops and those many divisions, a dozen or so divisions or more, instead of having those on the other side of the Rhine River to defend Germany when we crossed the Rhine River the following spring, those divisions weren't there. They had been annihilated. So if they had kept those units back there, it would have been a lot tougher on us when we crossed the Rhine, and they could have held out, they could have prolonged the war for many months. But as it was, they didn't have the troops, and they didn't have the equipment because they couldn't replace it that fast. So the Battle of Bulge ended the 28th of January, and the 23rd of February, we crossed the Rohr River, and the 23rd or 4th of March, we crossed the Rhine. So they didn't have time to rebuild and get their, they were running out of people. We were running into 14 and 15-year-old soldiers. And this was a shame. This was a shame. They were just children, really. And they didn't know how to defend themselves. They walked upright across open fields, and it was just, they bunched up, and I mean, it was just a slaughter of those kids. And then when we got further into Germany, they had what they call the Volkssturm, the Home Guard, and the People's Guard. And these were older men in their 50s, many of them in their 50s, late 40s. They were people who couldn't pass the physical for regular military service, but they were Home Guard. They put uniforms on them, gave them a few days training, showed them how to shoot a rifle or a machine gun, a Schmeisser machine pistol, and sent them to protect their homes, their homelands. And I encountered one of these fellows one time. I had a very close call. We were having a big, fast drive with the 2nd Armored Division across Germany. And whenever we run into any resistance, the infantry would D-truck, and we'd go out, clean up whatever the resistance was, or anti-tank guns or whatever, and get back on the half-tracks and trucks and go to the next, and go like hell to the next town and to the next objective. And then if we met any more resistance, we'd D-truck and do it all over again. Well, this was one of those occasions. And it was a kind of a wooded area, and it was kind of sloped down, and somebody had fired an anti-tank gun, so we all got down. We were cleaning out this wooded area, and I was going around the edge of the woods, and it was a slope like this. And as I come up over it, I was alone, and all I had was my carbine, and I was walking up over this little slope, and as I cleared the top of the slope, I was not much further than that camera is from me, from a machine gun position, a German machine gun position. And a machine gun was pointed right at me. And here's the war's almost over, and I'm going to take about 40 machine gun bullets right in the chest. And before I had a chance to do anything, the 2 men who were manning the machine gun stood up and held up their hands. They surrendered. I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe it. And so I didn't want to bother with them, so I told them to put down their guns. They had rifles and all that sort of stuff there, and I said, put all that stuff there and go that way. I didn't even want to bother with them. Go that way. You could surrender to somebody behind me, the troops behind me. And as I went further on, now I'm alert. I saw a man on the other side of a down lower, and it was like a little low wall, stone wall there, and some bushes growing out of it, and I saw a German soldier walking there. Now I'm ready. And I whip my carbine around and click, nothing. that damn, I didn't have a round in the chamber. And he heard the click, and at the same time, and I didn't know whether I had any more rounds in the clip or what the situation. I'd forgotten what the story was. So I threw my carbine down and I grabbed my trench knife and I jumped on this. He was a big guy. I jumped on this guy, and what you're taught, he was wearing a steel helmet, and he had the strap under his chin, which you should never do. This tells you he's not a pro, because you're taught that to attack a person like that, you jump them from behind, grab this, and pull their head back. If they've got their chin strap fastened, you pull their head back and cut their throat. And that's what I was about to do, to stab this guy in the throat. And as I jumped on his back, he was a big guy, jeez. And I grabbed him by the helmet. He knew, because he'd had the same training we'd had, or some of it, or had seen it. And he said, please, please, in German, bitte, bitte. Please, please, mein Frau, mein Kinder, my wife and children, he said. And he began to cry. This great big ox began to cry. And we were on the ground at that. I had knocked him down by that time. And what was he was one of these guys, he was well into his 40s. And he had no business being in uniform, but he was home guard. And he took out, after he saw his, I'm not going to cut you through, okay. So their word for surrender is comrade, comrade, comrade. So he reached in his jacket and he took out a photo folder and he showed me the pictures of his wife and children. And that's when I decided I was not a murderer either. And so I said, okay, you're okay. Leave your helmet off. Go that way. Go back for these other two guys. And I kept on going. But that's how bad things were in their army. They even had some women in uniform in the whole Volkssturm. And they had little boys, 12-year-old Hitler Youth. We were driving down one village. There was a Jeep in front of us, and I was riding my squad was in this half-track. We were the 2nd Armored Division riding with them. And we saw this kid in a Hitler Youth uniform run out from a house in this village with a machine gun. Up ahead, 2 or 3 blocks up ahead. He runs off the front steps of the house and sets up a machine gun in the middle of the street. I mean, nobody would do that. You never expose yourself like that. You always fire from concealment. And he goes right out in the middle of the street. Well, the Jeep in front of us has got a machine gun mounted in the Jeep. They had a pedestal there. Jeeps where you could put a fasten a pedestal, and there was a machine gun up there. And that GI was standing up in this Jeep, and he just blasted this kid. There was nothing left of him. And the kid's mother came out, and she was crying, and she was calling us murderers, criminals, everything you could think of. So why the hell did you keep him locked in his room? But the Hitler Youth were so indoctrinated. They were so indoctrinated. The other crushing experience I had was near the end of the war. The war was winding down. General Eisenhower put out the word that he wanted the soldiers, enlisted men, to see German concentration camps. Because the Germans were denying there was such a thing. And who do you believe? So he says, I want one enlisted man from every infantry company to go and see a concentration camp. And they were being liberated as we were crossing Germany. And that word came down to my company came. Nobody wanted to go. We don't want to go there. Who wants to go there? So I said, hey, wait a minute. That's going to be a couple days I'm not going to be. chance that I'm not gonna get shot. And the war's winding down, that's gonna be 2 days off the line. I'll go. So I volunteered. So a 6x6 truck came through and picked, the GIs on board. And this is gonna be a party day, for us. And so they took us to this place, and the people who were supposed to liberate this camp were a day late. So they had just liberated the night before this concentration camp. Instead, it was supposed to be liberated 2 or 3 days before that, but it wasn't. It was just had been liberated. And it was near Weimar, Germany. And the only camp that I know of, there was no name on it, the only camp that I know of was Buchenwald, was near Weimar. And so my best guess is that it was Buchenwald. And the people were still in the concentration camp, but were laying on their skeleton-like people, and dead people all over the place. And they were mostly Jews, some Catholics, some nuns, some priests, everything. And man, I didn't sleep for a week. It was just a terrible, you're a 19-year-old kid, boy, this is a terrible experience. I couldn't imagine, never in my worst nightmares could I imagine that any human beings could treat other human beings like that. And years later, more than 30 years later, when I was in Holland, friends of mine told me that some Jews who were from Holland and this man was an artist, and he had taken a piece of charcoal and he had gotten hold of some paper, some sheets of paper, and in charcoal he had drawn some artist's rendering of life in a concentration camp, people's faces and so on. And he had rolled these up into a tube, and hid it behind his bunk. And it had been found its way to these Dutch people in Holland, because they wanted to see if they could find this guy's family. And his family, of course, were all dead. And so the Dutch family gave those 4 drawings to me, those 4 sketches to me from Buchenwald, because they figured I had been to Buchenwald, and I figured I had been to Buchenwald. So they gave them to me, and I have them home. And in my will, they will go to the Holocaust Museum in Israel. So that's what's going to happen to them. But being, you can't imagine. You can't. It's beyond imagination that people could treat other people that way. I just can't. I just can't, because apparently in any civilization or any country, there are different levels of people. There are people who can commit horrendous, right here in Rome, there are people who can commit horrendous crimes, but most of the people are decent people.
Running out of tape.
Okay.
Alright. Did you see any of the civilians in the concentration camp, like the people from the town in the area?
No, they hadn't started to bring them out yet. They did. They made, it was the policy that they forced German civilians to walk through the concentration camps. And of course, many Germans, I think the vast majority of Germans never even knew there were such things as concentration camps. But the people who lived right in the village next to, they had to know. They had to know. And they claimed they didn't, but they had to know. Now you want to remember, the further we got into Germany, the more we found people who were members of the Nazi Party. They were party members, and they were the real Nazis. And as many of them could, fled to the mountains, the Harz Mountains, and the Schwarzwald, and to their camps and summer homes, stuff like that, to escape us and to escape the Russians. They sure didn't want the Russians to get them. And this civilian, they made the mayors and all the politicians want to go through there, and then they made the civilians dig the trenches, even though we had equipment to do that with. They made them by hand, by shovels, dig the trenches and bury the dead Jews. And I'm sure that they had a hard time living that down. But the German view of the war is entirely different than the Japanese view. The Japanese teach in school in their history classes that they were fighting a defensive war, that they only attacked us after they were attacked. And but the Germans cleaned up their act. And for example, it's illegal to have any type of insignia, to own any type of insignia, Nazi insignia in Germany. It's against the law to own anything like that. And although the Nazi Party now, there are some youth in Germany now who are trying to revive the Nazi Party, and the Germans are going to suppress that. Just look at the Ku Klux Klan here, you know, it's a terrible thing. I guess we're done.
What was it like meeting the Red Army?
It was a very strange experience. We were at Magdeburg. We liberated the city of Magdeburg, or captured the city of Magdeburg, big city, on the Elbe River. And the decision had been made by the politicians, the president, and Churchill, Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister of England, that the Allies would stop on the Elbe River. And that would be the line of demarcation, because you couldn't go out on some big open field someplace and have that to line, because their artillery shells could fall on you by mistake, or you could inadvertently shell them if you got too close to them. So the Elbe River was a big river like the Hudson, and it was wide and long and easy to find. So the Russians agreed that they wouldn't drop any shells beyond the Elbe River, and we agreed we wouldn't drop any shells on their side. But we were already in the Russian zone. But the only reason that we swept across Northern Europe like that over to the Elbe was so that that the Russians, even though we were in their zone temporarily, they wouldn't have access to Hamburg, Germany, and Denmark, and Norway, and Sweden. And Roosevelt and Churchill were afraid that if they got over there, they'd just keep right on going, because there wasn't anything to stop them. There's nobody there to stop them. So they were afraid that they would have a terrible time after the war getting them out of Norway and Sweden and Denmark. So they should go all the way to the Elbe River, and then that stops them. And that seals them off. And but the Germans were surrendering to us in battalion and regimental strengths. And they would come across, and anything that would float, or and these guys swam even across the Elbe River to surrender. And we would turn them back and say, bring up your kitchen equipment. Go bring your field kitchen. Because we have lots of food. I mean, the U.S. Army had plenty of food, but we don't have enough field kitchens and cooks to cook for all you people. Go get your field kitchen and bring your cooks and whatnot with you. And we'll give you the food. You can take care of yourselves. And so they would go back and get them. And we had one bridge across. The 2nd Armored Division put one bridge across the Elbe River. They put 5 bridges across, actually, but the Germans kept shooting them out. And finally, one bridge stayed, and they would bring all this stuff across. There were thousands of these guys, thousands and thousands of them surrendered because they didn't want to surrender to the Russians. And when the Russians got there, they were very strange people. They were very strange, very suspicious of us. They were very suspicious of us. And we had shipped the Russians under what they call the Lend-Lease program, thousands and thousands of 6x6 trucks. You know what I mean by 6x6 truck? The 6x6 truck was made by General Motors, but they licensed the Studebaker company to make them. And many of the Studebaker built 6x6 trucks were shipped to Russia. And they would ship them like 10,000 trucks at a time in convoy to Russia because they just didn't have the transportation. And we would see the Russian Army had these Studebaker built 6x6 trucks. And when we had a guy who was from South Bend, where the Studebaker plant was at that time, and he recognized that, he said, hey, these were made in my hometown. And the Russians said, no, they were made in Moscow. They were, anything that was shipped to them that said, like if it was a big box on a pallet, or a big box, or a big cargo box of any kind, or it would say, from USA to Russia, on it, be, you know, stenciled on it or something, some little message like that. They would paint all that out before I left the dock. Anything that marked any box or carton made in USA, or any identification, any words in English were all painted out. And the Russian people were told, in fact, they believed that we got our 6x6 trucks from them. And you couldn't convince them otherwise. You couldn't convince them otherwise. Now you wonder, how did we communicate with them? In every outfit, there's always some guy who speaks French, who's from Louisiana or someplace, who speaks French. There's always some guy who speaks Polish. There's always some guy who speaks Russian, because we have a mix of people. And so you never had to worry about somebody interpreting for you. And we had a guy who spoke Russian. In fact, he was of Russian descent. And he could communicate with these people. And he says, these people are nuts. He says, I don't know who told them I was junk, but they have an entirely different view on what's going on here than is really the case. But they were very suspicious of us, very suspicious. Of course, each one of their units of a certain size had a political officer with them. The military commanders had a civilian with them. And I think this was like from battalion strength up. They had a civilian with them who was a member of the Communist Party, and he reported directly to Moscow. He didn't go through any military channels. And if he saw anything that was suspicious in the conduct of any of the officers or anything, he reported him, and that guy got a bullet in the back of the head. They were, I mean, they had a very close rein on everybody, And there was, and the Germans were saying to us, interestingly enough, after we crossed the Rhine, they said, our country is beaten. You should keep on going all the way to Moscow. Your army should keep on going all the way to Moscow. We're not going home. Why should we do that, you know? The Germans wanted us to take Berlin. And we were only 40 miles from Berlin. I mean, we could have been there in one day. And of course, but the Elbe was the stopping point. And the estimation was that we would take 100,000 casualties to take the city of Berlin. And that's about how many casualties the Russians took. It was about 100,000 casualties to take the city of Berlin. No, they would have been us. They would have been us. And we would have had to give it to them anyway, because Berlin was in the Russian zone. It was occupied by the four powers. Three or four powers. Britain, France, United States, yeah, four powers. It was a divided city until the Berlin Wall came down when Reagan was president. East and West Germany were united, and that was the end of that. But from the day, we didn't know it, but from the day we arrived on the Elbe River, the Cold War had started. The Cold War had started. And they had an Iron Curtain mentality long before we heard of it, long before any of us heard of it. But they were and they were drunkards. Man, did they drink vodka, my God. Their soldiers were drunk all the time. I mean, it was unbelievable. Unbelievable. They were shooting out their rifles, machine guns in the air, and all this kind of stuff. Stay away from these people. So they stayed on their side of the Elbe River, and we stayed on our side. And then, an interesting thing, there were work camps all over where there were Russians and Ukrainians and Poles and whatnot in work camps. And these work camps were barracks type cantonment areas, and the people went into factories to work and out on farms to work and so on. They weren't paid. They were just slave laborers. And we were told that these people had to be repatriated. Now here we're in the big city of Magdeburg, the size of Syracuse. And we're supposed to round up all these people and ship them home by train. And so we were military government at that moment. We switched from combat role to a military government role on a temporary basis until the military government people would come over and take over all these cities, which would be a couple of months later. And our job was to post the names of these people. Of course, the Germans kept good records, and we would post the names of the people who would report to the railroad station, and they would be repatriated back home. Well, we found a lot of the people who were Russian prisoners. They would get on the train, and then the first time the train stopped, they'd get off and come back to Germany. And we said, the population isn't changing by very much. We're shipping all these people on there, and the population isn't going down the way it should, proportionately. And finally, the word came down that you would no longer post the names. You would be given a list of names, and then you would go to these compounds and arrest the people, put them in the city jail overnight, and the next day, under guard, put them on the trains. And if they try to come back, shoot them. They were threatened to shoot them. And our commander said, we're not going to do that. We're not going to do that. If they don't want to go home, we're not going to make them go home. We had a 2-star general as a command, our division command. We're not going to do that. That's the word came down from the military government people, the bureaucrats. He said, we'll run the train, we'll let the train go through here, we'll announce that the train is going through here, we'll post the names of the people. If they want to go, they can go. If they don't want to go, they don't have to go. We're not going to get involved in that. And we didn't. But what a crazy attitude. But one of the reasons that the Russians did not want to go home was they were going to be shot. Any Russian soldier who surrendered and who was returned home to Russia was shot because they were considered defectors. You died on the front line, or you stayed alive and fought, but you never surrendered. That was their philosophy. Can you imagine a people who conducted themselves like that? But they did. And so a lot of these people who had been taken, civilians who had been taken prisoner and made slave laborers in Germany, were afraid to go home because the word had filtered back that all was not well back there. And so they wanted to stay in Germany. And then we learned that a lot of the farmers who had slave laborers working on their farms and stayed right on, lived right on the farm, were on the QT, were setting aside pay for them, so that when the war ended, they'd have some money to go home with. if they wanted to go home. They weren't supposed to do that. That was illegal to do that. But many of the people were very decent people, and they appreciated the fact that they had farm help, because their farm hands are all in the service. So it was a strange thing. It was at the time, I found it very difficult to comprehend all this. Here I'm 20 years old, 19 years old. I wasn't even 20. Here I'm going to comprehend the world situation, international politics, and all this stuff. I'm lucky to be alive, you know, at that time. And I was not in any position to evaluate all this. I wanted to get home. But what I didn't know is that we were destined to go and invade Japan. As the war wound down, the decision was made that the Japanese main islands were going to be invaded by the U.S. Army. And my division was selected as one of the divisions to go there. And we had a point system. If you had 85 points, you went home and got discharged. But if you didn't, you were going to Japan. Actually, our advance party was already on Okinawa, setting up a training area and cantonment area for us to stay in while we were in Okinawa, preparatory to invading Japan. And here I had been in 5 major campaigns, wounded 3 times. Now I'm going to go to Japan and do this all over again. And I was very, very upset about that. And we were shipped back to England, and they were dredging out Southampton Harbor so the Queen Mary could get in there. And we were going to be put aboard the Queen Mary. The entire division was going to be put aboard the Queen Mary. They told us that we were going to go to the States, and from there on to Okinawa, or to the Pacific. But in fact, what was going to happen was the Queen Mary was going to go from there straight to Okinawa, and we weren't going to go home at all. We were going to do all our training in Okinawa because it was cheaper to do it there than it was to send us to the States, and then put us on trains and all of a sudden send us to the West Coast and put us on ships that could go straight there. And the Queen Mary traveled without escort, so they didn't have to worry about Japanese submarines, and because they were so fast. And but while we were in England waiting for the harbor to be dredged out, because it had sailed from Scotland from the day the war started in September 1939 until the war ended in Europe, it had sailed from Scotland. It was a safer place for it to sail from, because it was a big target for the German Air Force. So the Southampton Harbor had kind of silted in, and warships could get in now because they don't have the draft. They don't need as much water to get, even battleships don't take as much water to go in and out as an ocean liner. So they were dredging a little groove in Southampton Harbor, and while that groove was being dredged, 2 beautiful atom bombs were dropped on Japan. And Japan surrendered, and we did board the Queen Mary, but it was the day after Japan surrendered, VJ Day, and we went straight to New York and were discharged, went home on leave and then were discharged. So, if President Truman had not made the decision to use those atom bombs, I wouldn't be here talking to you.
Wow.
And a whole lot of other guys, about probably 400,000 or 500,000 GIs wouldn't have been here to talk to you, because it was going to be an absolute slaughter to invade those islands. They were equipping every civilian with a spear, a bamboo spear. Imagine that. And they had several thousand kamikaze airplanes set up in Japan in reserve, waiting for the invasion. It would have been terrible for us, and it would have been worse for the Japanese. They would have lost probably 1 million civilians in the process. It was it was just too terrible to contemplate. And for the people who think we were awful people to drop those 2 bombs, it was very rough on the people that got bombed, obviously. But it saved Japan. It saved their civilization, actually. And it certainly saved us. So the fellow who helped me write this first book that we're writing, and we're working on a second. In fact, Saturday we go back slaving away at this thing. Alan Foote was a historian. One of the things he asked me was, do you believe in divine intervention? And I said, Alan, I can only put it in this words: I'm here. You figure it out. But I got to know Alan, and I don't know if a copy of the book is in your library. It's in some of the schools here in Rome. The Young Liberators. I read an obituary in the Utica paper that this fella had died, and I look at the ages to see if it was anybody that was in any outfit that I know. And this fellow was in the 30th Division, had been in the 30th Division, and it was Alan Foote's father. And he had died up in New Hampshire, but the obituary, he was from Utica, and so the obituary was in the Utica paper. And so I called Alan on the phone and left a message of condolence on the phone, on his answering machine, and told him that I had also been in the 30th Division. Well, his father was a part of the cadre that stayed in Camp Landing, Florida, to train other people to go overseas to fill up the holes in the 30th Division. So he didn't go overseas, and so I never knew him. But that's how we got acquainted, and we started having lunch together once a week, and one thing led to another, and I wound up making 38 audio tapes while driving around in my car, and these were typed up and into a volume this thick, and we've been working off of that and the tapes on the first book, and now we're working on the second one. I tell everybody that there are no expletives in the book because we want it to be made available to school kids and kids of all ages, because this is part of their history. And after our generation is all gone, that's all we're going to have, our publications and the things and what you're doing. And so I wanted it so that if anybody bought the book and took it home and had it laying around the house, hopefully read by somebody, and if some 10-year-old kid picks it up, there aren't going to be a lot of dirty words in there that have no place in a good history book anyway. Of course, that cost me about 40 pages by omitting all that, because you heard the phrase swearing like a trooper. Well, GIs use a lot of bad language all the time, and it was just normal language. It didn't mean anything. But you couldn't put that in. I wouldn't put any of that in a book. Novelists do that, but that has no place in a history book. So that's that. What's the next? Are we almost done?
What is dispatch service and why were you placed on it?
Detached service.
Sorry.
Detached. I was detached from my unit. I received a fairly high decoration in the war, and the commanding general was, he wanted some people, and for public relations purposes, on his staff who had received higher decorations. And there were only 3 of us with a Distinguished Service Cross who survived, and only 1 with a Medal of Honor who was survived. The other fellow with a Medal of Honor who was still alive, who was in my platoon, Freeman V. Horner, had gone home and it was presented by President Truman, and he stayed home. And the only other one, all the rest of the fellows were dead, and all the rest of the fellows with the Distinguished Service Cross were dead. And because most of these awards are awarded posthumously. And so he wanted some people on his headquarters so that when he was interviewed by the press and the newsreel people and all that, he would have someone for them to talk to, like we're talking. And so I was detached from my regular duties and sent to headquarters. He said, we're not going to let any more of these guys get killed. From now on, when the DSC is awarded, they come to my headquarters, because I'm not going to take a chance on them doing some stupid thing and getting killed. So that's how I wound up there. And our job was to talk to the press and talk to war correspondents, people like that. So we got to know some of those people. And we travel every place the general went, we went with him. And if he took a plane ride to southern France to the Riviera, we went with him. Nice duty. And we ate fresh food. We were on K rations all the time. And the general's headquarters staff ate, you know, fresh eggs and fresh fruit and salads and all this kind of stuff. And this was like being in heaven. This was the Garden of Eden as far as we were concerned. And we would go through the chow line in the morning, and your eggs were cooked to order, and your flapjacks were cooked while you were standing there, you know, just like human beings. And this was part of it. He wanted to reward us. So he was a very nice guy. He was a graduate of West Point, class of 1915, and two of his prominent classmates were General Eisenhower and General Bradley. They all played on the same football squad. And they were very good friends. That's how we got to Queen Mary, because my commander had an in with the brass. You know, it helps to know a five-star general. So that's how we got to Queen Mary. And he came, of course, when we came back to the States, he came with us. And after he retired, he became the vice president of Colonial Trust Company in Rockefeller Center Bank. And after a respectable period of time, I went to visit him. I went down. I had to go to New York frequently, and I stopped in to see him. And I said, I don't want to take up your time, because you can't have everybody, you know, we had 15,000 men, you can't have all these people come running in and out of the bank taking up your time. And he said, you're the only member of the 30th Division who has ever come to see me. You believe that? None of the colonels, none of the majors, none of those people ever came to see him. He said, you're the only person who ever came to see me. I couldn't believe it. But he was such a terrific guy. He was a terrific guy. Our assistant divisional commander was a brigadier general. That's the way. He was a major general and a brigadier general. The other brigadier general was the artillery commander. And he was immediately promoted to major general during the tail end of the war. And then he was promoted to lieutenant general and negotiated the peace in Korea. He was the man who negotiated the peace, Lieutenant General William K. Harrison. And then after he retired, and we had advisors, where President Kennedy had sent advisors to South Vietnam to see what that problem was all about, and they were training the South Vietnamese. And the plan was that they were going to send troops over there to engage in the Vietnamese War. And General Harrison was recalled to active duty. Generals never leave the service. A general never is discharged from the service. He goes on inactive status, but he's never out of the service. He's at the beck and call of the president any day. And he was called back to active duty and sent to South Korea, or South Vietnam. And the president and the chief of staff and the brass wanted his evaluation of the situation there. He was there about a month. He told me this personally himself. He was there about a month, and he came back and he reported to the president. He said, "Get your advisors out of there and don't send any more troops to South Vietnam. Get your advisors out of there and stay out, because those people do not have the will to win. And their government is just as bad as the North Vietnamese. So get out and stay out." Nobody took his advice. Nobody took his advice. He told the Senate Armed Services Committee, the House Armed Services Committee, he told the Joint Chiefs of Staff, he told the President of the United States, the Vice President of the United States. They all heard this, his evaluation of the situation. Nobody listened. But he was right. He was right. And so we had, he was a very religious person. He was a Tennessee Baptist. And when I was assigned to division headquarters on detached service, General Hobbs, his boss, our division commander, he said, "Now Thayer, anytime you're around General Harrison, watch your language." Because he says, he really chews me out all the time when I swear. He does not approve of swearing. So he says, anytime you're around him, watch your language or he will skin you alive. So here's a 2-star general being chewed out by a junior to him, but they were such great friends and had such great respect for each other that they could do that. And General Harrison would say, "Leland, please don't swear. Please, it's not necessary. You have command of the English language," you know. And he would tell them all, and he would make them so ashamed of himself. So after all of this, and after his trip to Vietnam, he became a Baptist minister. He's a 3-star general, becomes a Baptist minister. And one of the conversations I had with him was while he was a Baptist minister. Can you believe that? A 3-star general becomes a Baptist minister. He was really something. He was really a very humanitarian, very human person. You don't think of generals like that. You know, you just don't think of people like that because they're tough. And they have to go up front. The assistant divisional commander, he's the guy that goes up front and pushes the colonels to push the GIs out in front to get killed. He is the hammer that does that. Yet he was a very religious, deeply religious, devout person. Nobody knew it. Boy, you wouldn't know it when he was on the front. He was a tough cookie. But he looked like he had steel-rimmed glasses, and he looked like a hotel clerk or something. I mean, he didn't look, or an accountant. He didn't look anything like a general officer at all. But he was a tough guy. He also had the DSC. So that's it. That's this thing here that I'm wearing. That medal is the Distinguished Service Cross.
Mind holding it up so I can get a shot at it? Can you point out to which one it is again?
Oh, it's the medal. It's the only medal that's hanging down.
Oh, I see. Okay. Okay.
Okay. Believe it or not, that this and the Medal of Honor are the 2 highest awards in the Army. And if you receive this, you got $3 raise in pay a month. And if you receive the Medal of Honor, you got $4 a month raise in pay. We spent billions on World War II, and we had a lousy $4 to give to a guy with a Medal of Honor. Can you imagine such a thing? But that's the way it was. It was a holdover from many years ago. Nobody ever changed it.
What do you remember most about
Go
Magdeburg?
back to Magdeburg.
Yeah.
That it was a big city. It's the last place I got shot at. And the people, I remember one thing about it. The 2nd Armored Division had gone on way into the Russian zone after, and gone into Berlin, in fact, as a show of strength, American. They wanted to show American presence, and the Russian let the 2nd Armored Division go in. They were part of our corps. And the 2nd Armored Division was coming back, and we were standing in the street. We were just living in this house, and there was an older man standing out in the house next door watching the 2nd Armored Division go by. And they go by, they go a few yards and stop, and a few yards and stop. That's the way you run, you know, an armored division. They don't go hell bent down the road 35 miles an hour. They go real slow. And this had been going on for hours. This armored division going by. And this man standing next door, and it turned out that he'd been a U-boat commander in World War I. And he asked us, he said, he asked the lieutenant, and my lieutenant, he said, how many Panzer divisions is that? And we said, 1. That's 1. And he says, how many do you have? Like, that was at 20. And he looked at these tanks going by, and he says, this is the language that all of Germany understands. How about that? He said, this is the language that all Germany understands. A tank going down the main street. That is the international language. And it was. I mean, everybody then knew that it was over with. But we got along very well with the Germans. Very well with the Germans. I had a lot of German friends. They were very good to us. And we had been warned that they would, you have to watch your back, they'll cut your throat, they'll put booby traps around when you're sleeping at night, you've got to have somebody on guard all night, all this kind of stuff. Of course, you had somebody on guard all night anyway. But be on your lookout because you're going into very dangerous territory. And the opposite was true. The opposite was true. The Germans were very good to us. Some were frightened of us until they got to know us. But by and large, we got along very good with them. I would say, well, in this cemetery I told you in Margaret, I was over there, the last time I was there was several years ago, and the superintendent of the cemetery, this American cemetery, it's like Arlington type of cemetery, and he said, other than the Dutch, the next highest number of visitors who come here, and the Dutch go there like 80, 90,000 a year, go visit that cemetery. He said, other than the Dutch, the Germans are the next highest group of visitors that come here. As I don't understand it, he said, I'll tell you something else you won't understand. He said, when I first got here, and he was newly assigned there, he was a civilian employee, in the national, whatever the organization is that runs our national cemeteries. He said, one day after I'd first newly arrived here, he says, 2 big tour buses showed up at the gate. And this fellow got out, and in English, he said, may we come in? Anybody can come in and visit. He said, well, we wish to have a memorial service here at the memorial that's standing there. And is that permitted? He didn't know one way or the other. He says, I guess so. I guess it's permitted. So there's about 60 people on each bus. They got off. They had a little military band with them. They got off. They had a clergyman hold a memorial service. These are Germans now. They held a memorial service. They played the Star Spangled Banner, and they had a bugler play taps. They put a big wreath around them at the monument, left, got back on the buses and left and went back to Germany. And he says, I don't understand. He said, I was absolutely flabbergasted that this occurred. So maybe what that lady said to my wife through the school teacher interpreter was really true. That the German people felt that the Americans had liberated them. That's the only thing I can think of. And I guess it was 2 days, I have a photograph of it. I think it was 2 days after 9/11, the people of Maastricht, this is a city of about 120,000 people, and this was fortified city, was fortified by the Romans in the year 287, when the Roman Empire extended all the way to the Rhine River. So this is an ancient city. The inner city is an ancient city. All the Roman roads are there still in their original form. And right after 9/11, 14,000 people from Maastricht came out to this cemetery and walked past the memorial. And in the guest book, of course, they used up a stack of pages in the visitor's book. And they wrote things like, the Dutch people will never forget. And we got letters from German people and Dutch people. Excuse me.
Look a minute so I can turn the camera on.